COVID-19, the novel coronavirus pandemic, and the whole state of the insane world right now, especially America, is definitely something that's on all of our minds. And studying the astrology behind it is an excellent way to improve our understanding of how transits really work and what kind of real-world effects they produce. So let's do that right now. And let's also look ahead to forecast how things are going to play out. Beginning of this whole mess was late 2019, and the coronavirus actually became a global issue, a pandemic, at the very end of December, which is coincident with this eclipse, which you see pictured here on the screen. And I have it in two rings because we're going to follow the transits on the outer ring in terms of how they relate to the positions at this eclipse. Now, I have at least 2, maybe 3 other videos on my channel that explain this eclipse in detail and how monumentally significant it is and how unlike other eclipses it is. If you want to learn about that in more detail, just search Victicara coronavirus eclipse. For now, let me summarize for you just the 3 most essential points about this eclipse that make it so unique. First of all, it's an eclipse which is almost exactly at the southern solstice, and furthermore is in Mula, which is the southernmost nakshatra, or the nakshatra which itself signifies as the south. So this eclipse is deeply connected with the symbolism of the south, which means death, underground, unseen, hidden. Now, that type of an eclipse that's at the southern solstice is rare enough in itself, but this one is really unique because the eclipse also consumed and involved by tight conjunction the planet Jupiter. And if you're at the southern solstice, that means you're in Capricorn. And if you're Jupiter, you don't like being in Capricorn. You're debilitated in Capricorn. So the real significant thing about this eclipse at the southern solstice in Mula is that it's consuming or swallowing a debilitated Jupiter. And Jupiter is a planet for positivity, fortune, growth, etc. So all of that's going to be consumed symbolically in this eclipse. And another interesting thing is that Jupiter is the ruling planet for the Declaration of Independence chart. So in other words, it's an extremely important planet for one particular country, the United States of America, which has really become the focal point for all of this insanity. Now, coronavirus sort of spread at what at the time we thought was an alarming pace, but in retrospect was a very modest pace for a few months. It was actually as February came into March that things started to get out of hand, and it was mid-March that we got an explosive global spread. If you look at what the planets were doing, by mid-February, Mars had also entered Capricorn. Now that's putting both of the significant malefic planets, Mars and Saturn, both in high strength, with Jupiter, who's still in Capricorn and debilitated. That's mid-February, and then what you get happening between mid-February and mid-March is that the flanking of this debilitated Jupiter by the 2 malefics. So these 2 malefics are bookending this debilitated Jupiter and tightening in. And where we get the peak of the tightening of the vice of Saturn and Mars sandwiching this debilitated Jupiter in Capricorn is mid-March, exactly when the coronavirus took off and exploded. So remember, the start of the affair is Jupiter getting in this eclipse at the end of 2019, and then the first trigger for the effects of it to really explode is when the 2 malefics in great strength, Saturn in Capricorn, Mars in Capricorn, come and sandwich Jupiter debilitated in Capricorn. That explosion was fairly brief, and by April it had plateaued. And the spread of the disease came to like a constant rather than an explosive growth. And also the fatality of the disease started to decline. So in April, we saw a lessening of the effects of coronavirus. And what we see astrologically is, well, that's because Saturn and Mars leave Capricorn and leave Jupiter alone, right? However, the coronavirus pandemic definitely didn't end in April, did it? And the way that you can see that represented symbolically in the astrology is that, well, as April progresses, Jupiter slows down, refuses to leave Capricorn, stations, turns around, and starts to regress. Saturn does the same thing. So by mid-May, both Saturn and Jupiter had decided that they didn't want to move away from the conditions under which they had signified the spread of the virus. Rather, they wanted to move back into those conditions. And what happened mid-May, late May, right after this turnaround of Jupiter and Saturn, the killing of George Floyd, which begins the next batch of madness and unrest and dissatisfaction and lack of prosperity and trust. Now, the coronavirus plateau sort of simmered until June. And once we got to June, we got an explosion which made the first one look a bit modest. And looking at the astrology, what you'll see is that the same indicators that indicated the first explosion again happen. So you get Saturn returning to Capricorn as Mars gets into Aries, where it again gets some sort of strength like it used to have in Capricorn, and where it's exactly square to where the eclipse was. So what we see by June and July is a return of these three planets, debilitated Jupiter, powerful Saturn, powerful Mars, back into their conjunction, although now it's Mars is conjoining by virtue of its aspect, not literally by its conjunction. And so the same thing which was indicated in the first conjunction happens again in the second. And finally, let's talk about what we might be able to foresee for the future. What we have right now, as we speak, is Jupiter is now at the position that Saturn was at when this initial eclipse for coronavirus happened. Jupiter's retrograde is going to stop in mid-September, and Saturn's is going to stop in late September. So that means that their movement back towards the coronavirus indication is ceasing then in September. However, they still remain in the basic positions that are indicative of this coronavirus problem. We still have Jupiter in Capricorn influenced by Mars and Saturn. So don't expect a solution to the coronavirus to come even by September. Maybe what you could hope for is another type of plateau where the increase of cases slows down. Now, this situation remains pretty much the same all the way until November. K2, if you've been noticing, has been on Mercury this entire time. When I say on Mercury, on this where Mercury was during the eclipse, because this eclipse is the significator of this new event, this new era that came out with coronavirus and involves all this unrest in America. That's indicated to start at this eclipse. So the positions at the eclipse are important. K2 is on the position of Mercury at the eclipse since April. So you have radically strange things being communicated. Radically weird communications, things you previously would have never have expected to hear before are being said. You also have in November Mars still in Aries, but now opposing Venus in Libra. Now, November is a significant time for America because that's when the election is supposed to happen. So all that you can foresee for this election is extreme polarity between Mars and Venus, the war and the peace, the tough guys and the liberal guys. Mars on one side, exactly opposite Venus on the other side, Venus in Libra, Mars in Aries, all while K2 is on Mercury, signifying wild and crazy things being said. You can expect clashes, violence, extreme unrest with this election in November. As we go past November and into December, we see Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars coming to peak intensity. So what I mean there is Mars is retrograded back towards the beginning of Aries. Now it's still aspecting Capricorn. It's still aspecting by square those areas where the planets were when the eclipse happened. Jupiter and Saturn are now at the apex of their conjunction in Capricorn. So around December, expect lots of unrest and a third wave of coronavirus. When we get to the next solstice, so when we get to December 21st, remember, because this all began on the previous solstice, December 21st-ish, 2019. Now, when we get to the 2020 solstice, we finally get Jupiter out of Capricorn. So we start to actually see a change of things, but not until basically the beginning of 2021. I don't expect that things are better by the beginning of 2021 because Jupiter is still in Saturn's sign with Saturn. And that was the situation which was current when this whole thing began with this eclipse. So, but I just see it being less in intensity. So I would think some kind of hope comes out. So maybe some vaccine or some solution or some cure comes out. And maybe some action is taken in the George Floyd case. And maybe some actions are taken against systemic racism in America. Beginning with the beginning of 2021. It's still not easy street because as you come to next summer, thankfully it won't be retrogressing all the way back into Capricorn. It'll stay in Aquarius, but there'll probably be a slight relapse towards this chaos in the summer of 2021. But at the start of 2022, Jupiter is finally going to leave Saturn signs and get into Pisces. So that's what I foresee as the end of the coronavirus era. Well, thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned a bit about astrology. And also, if you're a little familiar with astrological symbols, you may have gotten some deeper insight into actually what's going on here with Jupiter debilitated. I do discuss that in my other videos. So please do search for Victicara coronavirus YouTube or something to find those videos if you want to hear more from me about that. And other than that, just subscribe to my channel if you haven't already so that you can hear the next things I'm going to come up with, and give me a comment and a like and all that stuff. Thank you so much. See you again soon.